stop. Because this is the moment time stopped working. For decades, power in America had an escape hatch: delay, appeal, procedural fog, and no one mastered it better than Donald Trump. He didn't need to win. He just needed to wait. Wait out prosecutors, wait out judges, wait out consequences. That system just failed. The Supreme Court of the United States didn't argue. It didn't compromise. It didn't blink. It closed the clock. This wasn't a ruling. It was a deadline with teeth. And when deadlines arrive, power reveals its limits. If you want to understand how authority really ends, not with outrage, not with elections, but with enforcement, stay with me. Subscribe, pay attention, because this moment is not about Trump. It's about what happens when institutions decide they will no longer wait. And to understand why this is irreversible, we have to go back to the system that allowed delay to work for so long. To understand why this moment matters, you have to separate noise from structure. For years, Trump's legal battles were treated as political theater. Wins, losses, appeals, headlines. Each ruling felt decisive. And yet nothing ever actually happened. That wasn't accidental. The American legal system is built on process. Process protects rights. Process slows power. And in normal circumstances, that is its strength. But when process is weaponized, when delay becomes strategy, the system can be bent without ever being broken. Trump understood that instinctively. Every subpoena became a staircase of appeals. Every deadline became optional. Every loss became temporary. Judges ruled. He waited. Prosecutors pressed. He delayed. Time did the rest. What made this possible wasn't favoritism. It was inertia. Courts move carefully. Enforcement is rare. Contempt is the last resort, not the first. The system assumes good faith. But systems based on good faith fail when someone decides never to act in good faith at all. That is the context you need. Because what the Supreme Court just did wasn't about a single filing. It was a recognition that the old assumptions no longer apply. And once that realization sets in, everything downstream changes. This story doesn't begin in a courtroom today. It begins years earlier. With a simple request the system expected would be routine. In 2019, investigators asked to see financial records, tax returns, accounting ledgers, internal documents that most businesses surrender quietly. That request never reached compliance. Instead, it triggered a cycle that defined the next several years. Challenge the subpoena, appeal the loss, delay the deadline, repeat. Each step was legal in isolation. Together, they formed a shield. What made the shield so effective was time. Courts move slowly by design. Appeals take months, sometimes years. And every pause created distance between action and consequence. The longer the gap, the weaker the pressure. Trump didn't invent this system, but he exploited it perfectly. As deadlines slipped, urgency faded, public attention moved on, judges rotated, prosecutors recalculated. The records remained hidden not because the law allowed it, but because enforcement never arrived. This is how institutional decay happens. Not through collapse, but through tolerance. A system built to be careful slowly becomes permissive. Delay stops being an exception and starts feeling normal. Until one day, it isn't. Because when a pattern becomes obvious, when delay is no longer defense, but defiance, the system is forced to choose. And that choice is exactly what leads us to the first real rupture. The first real rupture didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with impatience. When Trump's legal team filed yet another emergency request, something changed. Not in the filing, but in the response. The court didn't engage the argument. It didn't parse the theory. It didn't weigh competing equities. It dismissed it. Not narrowly, not cautiously, decisively. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer lawyering. It was obstruction, a pattern so familiar that it no longer required debate. The court signaled that it recognized the tactic and would not participate in it again. That moment matters more than any single ruling. Because courts tolerate losing arguments, they do not tolerate bad faith. Once that line is crossed, patience evaporates fast. This was the first public sign that the system had recalibrated. The old rhythm, file, delay, repeat had stopped producing time. And without time, the strategy collapses. If you're trying to understand how power unravels, notice this point. Institutions rarely announce the end in advance. They simply stop cooperating. Stay with me. Because once cooperation ends, enforcement begins. And the next step is where the real pressure enters the room. Here is the mechanism most people miss. Courts don't lose power when they rule. They lose power when their rulings are ignored. For a long time, Trump's strategy exploited that gap, the space between judgment and enforcement, the assumption that compliance would eventually happen, that defiance was temporary. That delay was inconvenient but tolerable. The Supreme Court closed that gap. By labeling the latest filing as frivolous, the court wasn't just rejecting an argument, it was stripping it of legitimacy. In legal systems, legitimacy is oxygen. Once it's gone, everything changes. From that point forward, the issue stops being what the law says and becomes whether the court will be obeyed. That's why the language mattered. The court didn't warn abstractly. It named consequences: contempt, enforcement, incarceration. These are not rhetorical tools. They are mechanisms designed for one purpose: compulsion. This is the moment delay ceases to function as defense. Because delay only works when the system believes you'll comply tomorrow. When the system concludes you never will, tomorrow disappears. And when tomorrow disappears, power becomes immediate. That is the trap Trump now faces. Not political, not rhetorical, structural. And once a system activates enforcement, there is no elegant exit. That brings us to the second rupture, where pressure stops being theoretical and becomes personal. This is where the pressure spikes. Because once enforcement becomes real, every option narrows at once. There are no weekends built into this moment. No procedural pauses. No friendly gray zones. The deadline was engineered to eliminate oxygen. Accountants must produce records. Interference is already anticipated. Enforcement authority is already in place. That matters because it tells you the system is no longer reacting, it is prepared. For the first time, Trump's lawyers have nothing left to file. No higher court, no emergency appeal, no creative delay, just a binary choice: comply or be held in contempt. And contempt is not symbolic. Civil contempt escalates pain until compliance occurs. Criminal contempt punishes defiance regardless of outcome. One coerces, the other incarcerates. Together, they close the escape route Trump has relied on his entire life. This is why panic replaces confidence behind closed doors. Delay was his shield. The moment it vanished, exposure became total. What makes this second rupture so dangerous isn't the documents themselves. It's the reality that defiance now has a physical endpoint. And when power collides with a jail cell, mythology collapses fast. Now, the question isn't legal anymore. It's human. Now let's talk about you. Because this moment doesn't live in a courtroom. It lands in your daily life and what you believe about fairness, power, and consequence. For years, you were told the system works slowly, but eventually it works. That accountability may be delayed, but it arrives. Watching Trump evade deadlines again and again didn't just feel frustrating, it felt disorienting. It trained people to believe that power bends rules permanently. That belief is corrosive. When powerful figures never comply, everyone else learns a lesson they were never meant to learn. That obedience is optional if you're rich enough, loud enough, or important enough. This is why this moment hits differently. Because when the Supreme Court of the United States says enough, it isn't just speaking to Trump. It's speaking to every citizen who wondered whether rules were real or decorative. If you care about living in a country where law still means something, where delay doesn't equal immunity, pay attention, share this, talk about it. Because legitimacy doesn't survive silence. What happens next will shape how much faith people place in institutions for a generation. And that impact doesn't stop at America's borders. The shockwaves don't stop at the courthouse steps. Around the world, governments are watching this moment not as drama, but as data. They're asking a quiet question. Can American institutions still enforce limits on the powerful? For decades, the United States exported an idea that the rule of law was not optional, that even the most influential figures could be compelled to comply. That credibility doesn't come from speeches. It comes from outcomes. This case has become a test signal. If enforcement holds, it reinforces something fragile but essential, that democratic systems can still discipline defiance without collapsing into chaos. If it fails, the message travels fast. Autocrats learn that spectacle beats accountability. Allies learn that American norms are negotiable. Markets learn that uncertainty is structural. And uncertainty is contagious. Legal credibility shapes political stability. Political stability shapes economic confidence. Economic confidence shapes global alignment. This is how a single enforcement decision ripples outward through alliances, through investment, through trust. That's why this moment matters far beyond one investigation. It's a referendum on whether institutional authority still scales upward or only downward. Because if power is only constrained at the bottom, it eventually hollows out the entire structure. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. What happens next? From here, the future splits into three paths. Not predictions, structures. Outcomes shaped by incentives, fear, and enforcement. First scenario, compliance. Trump hands over the documents. The secrecy ends quietly, but the consequences accelerate fast. Investigators move from speculation to evidence. Subpoenas harden into charges. The narrative shifts from defiance to exposure. Politically, it looks like surrender. Legally, it's containment. Damage is real but controlled. Second scenario, resistance without defiance. A performance of reluctance. Delays at the margins. Public outrage. Private compliance. This preserves his image temporarily, but it poisons every future interaction with the courts. Judges remember. Prosecutors escalate. What once bought time now shortens it. This path feels safe, but it isn't. Third scenario, open defiance. Trump refuses, contempt follows, enforcement becomes unavoidable. The system crosses a line it has never crossed before. A former president meets the full weight of judicial authority. The shock would be global and irreversible. Institutions either prove themselves or expose their limits permanently. Here's the truth most people miss. Trump doesn't control which path is safest. The system does. And systems once activated do not negotiate. That's why this moment isn't about strategy anymore. It's about inevitability. And that brings us to the final question, what this means for the rule of law itself. This is how systems reveal themselves. Not in moments of popularity, not when rules are easy to follow, but when obedience must be forced. The Supreme Court has done the one thing institutions avoid until the very end. It removed ambiguity. It replaced patience with consequence. And in doing so, it turned a political spectacle into a structural test. If enforcement holds, something rare happens. Trust begins to regenerate. Not because the system is perfect, but because it proves it can still act when challenged. Delay loses its magic. Power loses its exemption. The lesson travels downward and outward. If enforcement fails, the damage is deeper. The law becomes conditional, compliance becomes optional, and the message settles in quietly. Rules apply until they don't. That is the line we are standing on. This isn't about Donald Trump anymore. It's about whether modern democracies can still compel obedience from those who refuse it. Watch carefully. Not the speeches, not the outrage. Watch the enforcement. If you want to understand where power is really going, subscribe. Stay with me. Because the next chapter isn't about one man. It's about whether the system still has teeth. And once you see the answer, you won't unsee it.